Hey, good afternoon. I want to thank my colleagues over at ACE UK for inviting me to share with you some thoughts on the ethical dilemma slot Monday afternoon. My name is Rabbi Effie Kleinberg. I'm the educational director at FJL, one of the partner organizations under the Jewish Futures umbrella in the UK. And I'm speaking to you live from my home in Israel. And today's topic in question is the question about rescuing people, taking care of people who refuse to follow the orders of government or health departments who are telling people to self-isolate or follow the rules of social distancing and our current crisis that we are going through as a society and as a world. And the question really is, do we have a responsibility in general? Does Jewish law have a responsibility? Does Jewish law advocate a responsibility to rescue those who put themselves in danger, put themselves in harm's way? And if so, to what extent does the law require rescue officials, military, whoever's involved in rescue efforts to help individuals who flout and violate the rules that have been put in place by governments and by health departments? Just a few opening thoughts before going into some of the precedent in Jewish law for addressing this question. So first of all, we have to state the obvious. Maybe it's not obvious to all, that it's challenging enough for health professionals and whoever else is involved in putting in place the safety and health, overall general health of the people in the city, the people in the country. These health professionals are doing this at a risk to their own health, to their own work. Probably not what most medical students think when they sign up to go to medical school, that they're going to be required to put themselves in a compromised situation where their own health will be at risk. The level of risk is definitely not the same as somebody who signs up to be in a military, where the risk is much higher. Police officer, a firefighter for that matter. So the reality is, and we've seen these statistics already in many countries, that people who are in the health professional community have fallen ill. Some have died from the virus. It's a clear threat to those who are involved, and we laud their work and are incredibly grateful for all that they are doing. And then to boot, we have individuals who flout the rules, who make an impossible situation even more challenging and even worse in some ways. So that's opening comment number one. Opening comment number two is that we have precedent in history, in other events, in other international crises or local pandemics or natural disasters, where people flouted the rules. People did not listen to the instructions of local officials, whether it was the health department or local government, federal governments in some cases, to listen to the instructions. So for example, 2012, the United States, in particular the Northeast region, the tri-state area, was hard hit in a hurricane called Hurricane Sandy. And there were evacuation orders for numerous areas, especially along the coast, the East Coast, where the hurricane was hitting the hardest. And there were evacuation orders that were given to these areas, and people had to follow these orders. And many people said, "We're not going to follow the orders. We're going to stay at home. We're going to remain in our homes, and we're going to flout these rules. Everything's going to be okay." But what would the government's responsibility be toward these individuals in the event that they are surrounded by water all around, and now they're standing on the roof, and they require evacuation? after. So in that case, the governor of New Jersey, for example, at the time was Chris Christie. He said, we're not going to be able to help people who don't follow the evacuation order. Simple as that. Either because we just won't be able to get there, it'll be too difficult to traverse through the debris and other type of damage done to the roads to be able to save people, to rescue people, and might not be their responsibility anymore from a legal perspective. And those were the words of the governor at that time. That was in 2012. So fast forward to 2020, and we have stories all around the world of individuals in cities, in countries, who are flouting the rules, who are not following the instructions of the health department to self-isolate, to quarantine, to not travel, to social distance, all the different rules based on country that we've heard about. And in some countries, they're handing out fines, and they're maybe even considering jail time for certain individuals. These people might themselves get infected and require medical treatment and require themselves to be treated for the virus. What is the medical community's responsibility, the government's responsibility toward these people? So let's begin from the biblical sources. The biblical sources, two biblical sources for rescuing someone who's in danger. Believe it or not, the one that might be obvious to most is not actually the main source. The one that's obvious to most is the statement in the Torah, in the Bible, do not stand idly by your fellow's blood, which in Hebrew is lo ta'amod al dam re'acha. And this, according to the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin, is not the main source for the requirement to rescue an individual who's, let's say, drowning in the sea and can't swim back to shore on their own, and you are walking by and have the ability to jump in and rescue them. The main source for the requirement to rescue someone whose life is in danger is from the laws of Hashavat Avedah, which is the area of Jewish law which requires an individual who finds an object on the road that seems that the owner is not there. That object has to be returned to its owner. One has to do investigation and find out who the owner is and try as best as one can to return the item to its respected owner. This area of Jewish law, although its context is within the discussion of property, of one's property, lost property should be returned to its owner, the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin understands and extrapolates this principle to the discussion of saving another's life, a person whose life is in danger, a responsibility to save another's life. And it comes from the fact that if one's property is important enough to be considered to be returned to that individual, how much more so is a person's life, a person's very life, which is also one's property, perhaps, that one would be required to do all that one can in one's power to return their body to themselves, to rescue them from that impending danger, that a danger that they are now in. If so, what happens to the source in the Torah of do not stand idly by your fellow's blood? So there, the Talmud says there's really two sources to the obligation to rescue someone who is in danger. There's the source of Hashavat Avedah, returning lost property to a person, in this case, their body, their physical body, and there's the source of do not stand idly by your fellow's blood, which would require, says the Talmud, one to even spend their own financial resources to go ahead and save and rescue someone. So if it would require someone to drive somewhere, be gas money, if it would require someone to pay for medication, whatever the circumstance would be, lo ta'amod dam re'acha, the requirement of not standing idly by one's fellow's blood, would require a person to spend money to rescue someone whose life is in danger. So we have these two sources that are both biblical, that both speak about the concept of rescuing a person whose life is in danger. And they both require us, to a reasonable extent, on the surface level, to put ourselves out there to be able to rescue somebody else. If one, in the case of a person who's drowning, who cannot swim back to shore, if one is not a strong swimmer, not a lifeguard, not trained in any type of treading water or holding your breath underwater for length of time, and one determines that if they themselves jumped in to try to rescue, that would be a danger to them, of course, Jewish law would conclude in that case that one would not be required to rescue somebody if it would be at the expense of one's own well-being or life. But under reasonable calculation, if one sees an opportunity to rescue somebody else and it doesn't create a danger to the individual who can save or rescue, then one would be obligated. What's interesting about the challenge of the medical and health professionals in terms of the Jewish legal discussion is perhaps they are putting themselves in harm's way. What would require them beyond just, maybe call it altruism, maybe call it doing the right thing? Perhaps the risk is too high at a certain point that even medical professionals they're more qualified than anybody else to help these individuals. That would be an interesting question to discuss at a different point. So there's a debate: what happens for a reckless person? How do we apply these sources, these biblical sources, to a person who's reckless, to a person who flouts the instructions, violates the health department's rules of how to keep oneself safe and keep others safe by doing so? So we could view, on the one hand, we could view one's money and body, one's property, one's physical property and one's body in the same light. That really we look at them in the same way. There's a rule in the laws of lost objects, of lost property in Jewish law, and the rule is that if a individual abandons their property, they leave a dog unleashed and they walk away and the dog just wanders around, and it seems that the owner just has abandoned this item, this object. Or their wallet, they throw their wallet to the middle of the street, a busy street with thousands of people. They're showing about themselves that this item, this object, doesn't mean that much to them, and they don't really hope to ever get it back in return. If so, applying that logic to the case of a person's body, if a person is reckless with their health, with their physical body, then perhaps one could argue that we have no responsibility to rescue them because they've shown themselves to be reckless and abandoning, so to say, their own life. Abandoning their own life would say about this person that they don't have that care, and this is all going to be assuming that they're in a good state of mental health. Mental health would factor in here, and it is one of the variables that is discussed in the Jewish legal discussions. That's on the one hand. That's one way to look at it, to compare and to put on the same playing field one's property and one's life. So if one abandons one's property and there's no obligation to return that to a person, same would be true if a person abandoned their own life, their health. One would not be required to do what one could to return their life, to rescue them if they would put themselves in danger doing something reckless. On the other hand, we could look at the property that a person has and their life and their physical body and their health as not being on the same playing field. To the extent what we mean by that is that property, your wallet, your car, your home, the things that you own are the things that you own. They're your property. They're your ownership. They're under your ownership. And therefore, if something gets lost, we have a responsibility to return it to them. Someone abandons it, you're saying, I'm abandoning ownership over that item. We don't have to give it back to them. But your body may, in fact, in a Jewish legal setting, not actually belong to you. Few examples from Jewish law where this comes up. One is the fact that committing suicide, which is a biblical prohibition, committing suicide would would in its root be connected to the fact that your body is a gift. Your body is yours. It was given to you by God to watch over it, to guard it, to take care of it, to not do things to it that could cause it harm. And therefore, if your body is not your own, you can't do things to your body that could cause it harm. You're doing something to property that's really is not yours. Another concept that comes up in Jewish law in this context is the fact that a person is not allowed to testify against himself in court. A person walks into court and says, I murdered somebody. The court is not allowed to accept that testimony as a proof to convict them for murder. A further discussion that Maimonides has in the Code of Jewish Law writes that if a family would like to put up a ransom to a court for a convicted murderer, the court may not accept that ransom. And the reason, says Maimonides explicitly, and this is repeated again by numerous other rabbinic authorities, one's body is not one's own property. One can't be the authority to decide what one's going to do with the body that they have that's a gift to them. A second precedent, after laying out these two biblical sources, and therefore, in conclusion of the second way of analyzing these sources, one would need to rescue a reckless person, perhaps even to violate Shabbat, as some of the authorities explain, to do so. We really have, that's the reason why this is an ethical debate, we really do have two sort of approaches, two camps, two schools of thought on how to understand this responsibility that Jewish law puts upon us, or those who are able to rescue those who put themselves in danger, put themselves in harm's way. There's a story in the Talmud about the sage Hillel. This would be the second sort of precedent that we want to look at. Hillel, the sage, who would work half the day, spend half of his wage to buy food for his family, and the other half of his wage he would spend as an entrance fee to get into the study hall, the Torah study hall, with the students of the yeshiva. There was one incident where Hillel was unable to get his wage. It was a cold winter day, but he wanted to go in for the lesson, for the class. So he went up to the roof. He couldn't get in the front door because he didn't have an entrance fee. He went up to the roof and he stood on some open window to listen in on the class that was being delivered. In the morning, the students came back into the study hall and they saw that there was something blocking the skylight. Lo and behold, it was Hillel the sage, who had essentially froze up there and covered in snow. And they quickly brought him in, warmed him up, so on and so forth. And the discussion in the commentaries is, were these sages who went to rescue Hillel, were they required to even rescue him in the first place? Hillel put himself into a scenario of danger, and this scenario of danger clearly was objective. It was cold, it was snowy, it was frigid temperatures. What gave Hillel the right to go into this situation? Leaving that question aside, what required anyone to put resources into rescuing him? And the answer that some give is that Hillel was involved in a Torah commandment of studying Torah. So from his perspective, he was doing something that would give him some kind of protection, and therefore he's not considered negligent, he's not considered reckless, perhaps, and would be permitted for others to attempt to rescue him. A third precedent, which is a discussion in the Tractate Sanhedrin, is the scenario of the home intruder, known as the topic of the Baba Machteret, the home intruder, a person who breaks and enters somebody's home. The assumption of the rabbis in the Talmud is that this individual is prepared for a confrontation. They're coming in to rob, they're coming in to take items from the home, but they're prepared for a confrontation because they know psychologically that the owner of the house is not going to just allow an intruder to come in and take things from the house and destroy the house. The owner is going to put up a fight if he's able to. Therefore, the intruder says, I'm going to arm myself in the event that there's going to be a confrontation. And the Torah gives explicit permission to the homeowner to preempt that eventuality of the intruder trying to harm or trying to fight in a confrontation with the homeowner, and the homeowner has permission to kill the intruder into the home. This is the law of the home intruder, the Baba Machtera. The Talmud discusses the following scenario. What happens if while the home intruder is breaking into the house, the walls of the home fall on top of the home intruder, and the intruder gets stuck under the rubble, and it's Shabbat. Removing the stones on Shabbat would be a violation of the laws of Shabbat. That's clear. The question is, are we permitted to violate Shabbat to rescue this individual's life, even though his intention perhaps was to kill, was to take a life, to destroy a house, to destroy a life? So the Talmud says as follows: if the person intended to kill, the commentators explain, if he intended to kill, we are not required to rescue him, because essentially by breaking and entering, by being an intruder, he forfeited his life. Even though at this very moment he doesn't perhaps pose a threat to anyone anymore. He knowingly put himself in harm's way. And therefore, one could extrapolate and connect this to our original question about rescuing someone who put themselves in danger. This could perhaps apply to it as well. The Talmud does say that if the case was a person didn't intend to kill, then yes, we would rescue this individual on Shabbat. The differentiation in the Talmud is usually it talks about a father and a son relationship. So a loving relationship where you have an individual who's breaking in. It's very clear that their intention is not to kill. Their intention is they lost their key, perhaps. Unclear how that works, but we're not always allowed to just confront someone and say, I'm going to take your life because you're breaking and entering. There are cases where it would not be permitted. So that is the third precedent. Two more. Fourth one is the case of voluntary starvation. There's a Talmudic debate over someone who has means, has the financial resources to purchase food for themselves, but they decide, I'm going to be cheap. I'm not going to spend money on my lunch, on my dinner, on groceries for my family. I'm going to rely on the charity of the community to provide for my needs. I'm not going to use my financial resources to support myself. Does this person, are we required to provide the charity for this individual? So there's a debate, two different opinions in the Talmud. The final decision, the conclusion in Jewish law is that we are not required to take care of such a person. Although one could differentiate between the case of an individual who voluntarily starves themselves versus the case of returning a lost object, returning an individual who puts himself in danger. And the difference we would say, we could suggest, is that in the case of the voluntary starvation, the person has financial resources. They're not actually in danger at the moment. They can take the credit card out of their pocket, go to the grocery store, take the cash out, and buy food. The individual who's drowning in the deep end of the pool, the deep end of the ocean, they're in imminent danger at this moment. There's nothing that's going to help them except for somebody else who's going to come and rescue them. So perhaps one could argue that the case of voluntary starvation is not it's not an absolute proof that a person who puts themselves in danger, who flouts the rules of the government and the health department, that we would not be required to rescue them. And lastly, the Talmud discusses the question of ransoming captives who sold themselves into captivity. Probably a hard, dire situation where a person would do such a thing. And the Talmud says that we are obligated, to ransom them up to 3 times. And even then, after the 3rd time that they've done this, that they've sold themselves, and we ransom them each time, if they're in a situation of danger after that 3rd time, we're still required to rescue them. So this source is quite strong in the direction of how far we must go to go out and help people who are not helping themselves, and not only are they not helping themselves, but they're putting themselves in harm's way. However, and to boot, the Talmud's case is a case for the individual. The paradigm case is a case where the individual sold themselves to a cannibalistic tribe. One could think of a situation of danger greater than that. And we see the requirement that Jewish law places in the community on those who are able to be involved in a ransom, to be involved in rescuing this individual. However, there is a limit, as we mentioned, 3 times. 3 times, as long as there isn't danger to this person's life. Lo tamar damecha, do not stand idly by one's fellow's blood. It's true, and we have to do all we can, but there are limits. The Talmud is clearly stating that there are limits to this requirement. A person who continuously puts themselves into danger and continuously doesn't listen to the authorities and continuously doesn't protect themselves and protect others by protecting themselves, maybe we wouldn't be required to help such a person. So these are some of the precedent cases. In conclusion, some concluding thoughts. Number 1, we have to do our best to follow the instructions of the health department and the laws from the government. These instructions were put in place not only to help us keep our own health and keep our own safety, but maybe more important, in the case especially with younger people, to save the lives of others. That's number 1. It's very clear how important it is and how critical it is, not just to perhaps over time help the overall situation improve, but to protect ourselves. We have a responsibility to follow these laws. We have to follow the laws of the land that we live in, of the countries that we live in. Dina de malchuta dina, and that's a requirement. But also say legally, governments may actually have a responsibility to save everyone, even those who are putting themselves in harm's way. One of the interesting questions and scenarios, which I think would be a real case study for this current crisis, would be a case of triage scenario. If 2 people called up, there was 1 ambulance that could rescue 1 individual, only room for 1 person in the ambulance, and they could only get to 1 place to bring them to the hospital. 1 individual was an individual who was violating the government and health department's rules, and the other individual was following the rules. So perhaps here, in this case, the government could say, triage, we're going to go for the person. The first choice is going to be the person who's been following the rules. The person who hasn't been following the rules is going to come second. This person has shown themselves not to care about the rules that we said. We have perhaps less of an obligation to rescue them over somebody else. May we see a speedy end to the current pandemic and not have to grapple with such challenging questions and issues, hopefully very soon. Thank you very much for joining and watching this class.